Welcome to Underline This podcast, a podcast where we unpack the big ideas, hide in the margins, because the best parts, they're between the lines. Today we got one of the best podcasts we've ever done, and that will be True Grit by Charles Portis. As per usual, we'll give you a summary, as well as key themes, background on the author, symbolism, and then specific to this podcast today, I'd like to break down the top 3 True Grit moments. Now, to lead this discussion, I'd like to give a definition of what grit is. Now, according to Wikipedia, our most reliable source on the internet, grit is a positive, non-cognitive trait based on a person's perseverance of effort, combined with their passion for a particular long-term goal or end state. This perseverance of effort helps people overcome obstacles or challenges accomplishment and drives people to achieve. Now, before we get into the top 3 True Grit moments, let me prime you with a little background, and then we'll unpack the True Grit moments. True Grit is a frontier revenge story told by Mattie Ross, a sharp-tongued, deeply moral woman recalling the events of her youth. And at 14, Mattie hires the aging U.S. Marshal Rooster Cogburn to track down Tom Chaney, the man who murdered her father and fled into the Wild West frontier. Mattie joins Cogburn and a Texas Ranger named LaBeef on a dangerous pursuit across harsh terrain. And what unfolds is a less than conventional Western adventure and more a study in resolve, justice, and moral absolutism. Now, Mattie's unwavering sense of right and wrong collides with a world governed by violence, decay, and compromise. And the hunt culminates in betrayal, gunfire, and sacrifice. Mattie achieves justice, but at a deep personal cost. And the novel closes decades later, with Mattie reflecting on what grit demanded of her and what it took from her in return. And the story is about heroism in the romantic sense. It's about endurance, duty, and the kind of courage that refuses to bend even when bending would be easier. Let's talk about Charles Portis, who's the author of this book. Charles Portis was born in 1933 and passed away in 2020. He was a journalist, tuned novelist from Arkansas who had a deep fascination with American vernacular, regional character, and understated irony. Before True Grit, he worked as a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune, covering everything from civil rights, protest, to everyday human absurdities. And Portis wrote True Grit in 1968 at a time when the mythic American West was being re-examined and demystified. Vietnam and cultural upheaval had made traditional hero narratives feel hollow, and anti-heroes and moral ambiguity were replacing clean-cut legends. And rather than glorifying the frontier, Portis stripped it down. His motive seems less about nostalgia and more about examining how people justify violence when it's framed as justice. And his genius lies in letting the language, especially Mattie's voice, do the heavy lifting. Now, the novel's tone is dry, exacting, and quietly devastating. Let's talk about some key themes from the book. Justice versus mercy. Mattie believes justice is non-negotiable, and mercy is irrelevant. This rigidity drives the story and raises an uncomfortable question. Is moral certainty a virtue or a kind of blindness? And in this case, I would say it's a blindness. And there's a little bit of symbolism here in her journey that she goes on, because Mattie, when her father is murdered, she is in civilization. She's highly educated. She's with family. She's got comfort, wealth. And when her world is rocked with the death of her father, she then leaves that world of familiarity and civilization, and she pursues the killer into his own world of chaos and lawlessness, which is the American frontier at that time. Next, true grit as endurance. Grit isn't bravado, and it isn't toughness. It's the willingness to persist without complaint, without softness, and without exception, even when it destroys something inside you. That's a key point, because what ends up happening to our characters, who are all our true grit characters, one, we have Rooster Cogburn, the hardcore bounty hunter, and when Mattie finds him, he has one eye and he has scars on his face. He has a very tough personality, and this is someone that has had to live a life of grit. Then you've also got Mattie, who in her pursuit of revenge ends up losing her arm because she falls into a snake pit after she tries to kill her father's assassin. And so that's what I was referring to earlier when I mentioned that revenge takes a bit of her, quite literally her soul, some of that civilization, that comfort, but also her arm that was bitten. Next, we have aging and decline. Rooster Cogburn is not a shining lawman. He's bloated, one-eyed, and morally compromised. The book suggests that the legends we admire often look far worse up close. Now, when we say that he's morally compromised, that means that, well, in a couple examples from the book, you'll notice that there are times when he's negotiating with criminals in order to achieve his goals. And when that happens, he actually makes promises such as, if you give up Cheney, the man that killed Mattie's father, that what he'll do in exchange is he'll give them several hours or several days of advanced fleeing so that they have a greater chance of escaping. Next, we got voice, authority, and control. So Mattie's command of language is her power. She's an excellent communicator. She's very well educated. She's a thinker. And as a young girl in a male world, especially out on the American frontier, she controls outcomes not through force, but through precision, memory, strategy, and relentless logic. Last key thing that we'll talk about is the cost of moral absolutism. So Mattie gets what she wants, but the novel quietly asks whether getting what you want is the same as winning. Something that I think is fascinating about Mattie is that she's someone that likes to be in control because of her gift for language and communication and strategy and just her ability to think better than others. I think gives her a sense of control most of her life. And in this case, because she didn't see justice being done, she wasn't able to see it firsthand. When I say justice, I'm referring to the justice of her father's assassin being put in prison or executed, whatever. She decides to take matters into her own hands and hires a lawman, Rooster Cogburn, to go and pursue Tom Cheney. And because of that, she gets what she wants, where she sees Tom Cheney killed, but it was through frontier lawlessness of having a bounty hunter hunt him down, and then ultimately she is the one that kills him. Now, the cost of... Oh, we talked about that. Let's talk about major symbolism here. So first, the frontier. Now, the frontier represents a moral testing ground, not freedom, but exposure. There are no systems to hide behind, only choices and consequences. I mentioned before that the frontier almost represents the Rubicon that Mattie decides to cross, because when she's pursuing Tom Cheney, she leaves civilization and she goes out into the frontier, which is lawlessness. So when you think of civilization, you think of laws and order and organization, and the frontier is everything but that. It is just nature, raw nature and lawlessness. Next, Mattie's missing arm that we talked about a little bit earlier. The physical loss mirrors the emotional cost of her unwavering pursuit of justice. She keeps her principles, but ultimately loses a part of herself. Rooster's eye. So I mentioned before that Rooster Cogburn is one-eyed. He's got an eye patch that covers one of his eyes that he lost due to fighting in the Civil War, and his missing eye symbolizes partial vision, meaning moral compromise, selective justice, and the limits of experience as wisdom. Last of all, language itself. So Mattie's language is very formal. It's almost biblical diction that contrasts with the brutality of the world that she's in. Civilization survives not through softness, but through structure and memory. One of the topics I also want to talk about this, that I didn't mention at the beginning, is comparing the book versus the film adaptations. I was raised on the 1969 film with John Wayne, and in this adaptation, John Wayne, of course, in every movie he's in, he's the hero, and he plays Rooster Cogburn, who in this film is really our protagonist. Yeah, we have Mattie, but they portray her as being very annoying, and really you're rooting for Rooster Cogburn, John Wayne, in the end. And one of the different adaptations in the 1969 film versus the book is that Mattie is softened and sentimentalized, and the tone leans toward classic Western myth. And John Wayne's performance is iconic, but less faithful to Portis's irony. Then you may have seen the 2010 film, which was directed by the Coen brothers, and this is much closer to the novel. I really enjoyed reading this, and as I was reading the book, I began to compare the John Wayne version versus the Coen brothers version, and this one certainly is a lot more aligned with the book, because Mattie's voice and rigidity are preserved, and you see that from when she's a young girl until at the very end when you see her as a older, one-armed version of herself. And the humor is darker, and the violence is a lot colder as well. Now, the ending retains the book's bleak and reflective weight. So the key differences here is that the book is really focused on Mattie's story, and even the best film adaptations inevitably tilt attention toward Rooster. And on the page, Mattie is a true force of nature. So, why does true grit still matter today? True grit redefines strength as discipline, not dominance. It challenges the idea that justice is inherently noble, and it gives us one of literature's most unusual narrators, a woman who never doubts and never softens. And it dismantles the Western myth without mocking it. It asks a haunting question: what does it cost to live a life without compromise? And is the cost worth paying? So something to think about. Now that we have ultimately given you a thorough rundown of the book True Grit, let's talk about the top 3 true grit moments from this book. So, number 1, I would say Rooster Cogburn racing back to civilization to save Mattie after her falling into a deep rattlesnake pit, breaking several bones, and being bit with a rattlesnake. So as this happens, Rooster realizes that they've got to get her to a doctor as soon as possible, and that best outcome is that she loses her hand. He climbs down, pulls her out of the pit, rides her horse, and they ride into the night. And as the horse begins to lose strength, Rooster starts using his spurs to try and get it to go faster, and it ultimately does, but then he has to go to more extreme measures. And as the horse begins to slow down, he actually pulls out his knife and slices the side of the horse, making it use its energy. And finally, it collapses due to extreme exhaustion, and he has to put the horse down. At that point, he then has to pick up Mattie, and he has to run her through the frontier and barely gets her to a doctor who's able to amputate her arm and give her antivenom. That is the number 1 true grit moment. Now, number 2, I would say, is Mattie's revenge against Tom Chaney. So we can see, I think in life, we've all realized that revenge can be a very powerful fuel, depending on the context and the case. So we'll analyze that from a case-by-case basis. But Mattie finds, in her story of revenge, she doesn't just go to the law. She goes to find and pay the hardest bounty hunter, Rooster Cogburn, and braves the wild frontier. She sleeps in the cold. She braves the elements, comes face to face with killers, and ultimately her father's murderer. She's also bitten by a rattlesnake and has her arm amputated. That revenge is her fuel for her grit. So revenge in this case is the fuel for the grit that she's able to encapsulate and endure against the trials and also the harsh elements of the Wild West frontier. Third, Cogburn's horse charge. So if you've seen the movie, it's the same in the book. There's a moment where Rooster Cogburn is confronting the gang that Tom Chaney is with, which is the Lucky Ned Pepper gang. And what he does is they begin to exchange words, and then when they see that it's going to turn to a showdown, Cogburn grabs the horse's reins, puts it in his mouth, bites down, and then he uses both of his free hands to hold 2 rifles, and then begins to ride at the Lucky Ned Pepper gang head on. And he actually kills every single one of them, except for Lucky Ned Pepper, who strikes him, but then is sniped from afar by LaBeef. So those are the top 3 true grit moments. Now, in conclusion, true grit is a masterclass in how voice shapes truth, how moral clarity can be both empowering and tragic, and how grit, real grit, is rarely glamorous. It looks like Rooster Cogburn or Mattie, which one of them has 1 eye and the other has 1 arm. Because now, in conclusion, the best parts aren't in the gunfights, they're in what survives afterward. Thank you very much for listening today. Please give us a follow wherever you get podcasts and follow us on social media. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.